we were with a music therapist, and she guided us through music and would play for him. And I asked her to play Old Man by Neil Young. And I attempted to sing it to my dad, and I'm sitting on his bedside. And of course, I didn't get through 10 seconds of the song before I lost it and just completely broke down crying. And I remember getting to lay my head on his chest and cry, and he was just like rubbing my head, telling me that it's going to be okay, and like kissing my forehead like I was a little girl. And just that tender moment was just, I will never forget it.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. On Mother's Day 2020, with COVID beginning its march around the globe, Alison Zimmerman got the news that her dad was being rushed into emergency brain surgery after an ER visit for a headache took a dramatic turn. Her dad survived the surgery, to wake up to no peripheral vision, short-term memory loss, disorientation in time and space, and a terminal glioblastoma diagnosis. Alison swung into action right away, first by being there for her dad's initial recovery from surgery, and then by relocating indefinitely from her home here in Steamboat Springs to be with her dad for the duration of his cancer battle. A battle that included COVID-induced isolation in the hospital and being treated by medical staff in hazmat suits, 2 months recovery from surgery, aggressive radiation and chemo treatments, and a Gran Mal seizure that nearly killed him. After about a year of fighting the cancer, an MRI revealed that the tumor was growing. The medical community discontinued treatment, and Alison cared for her dad until his death in March 2022, just 10 months ago as of this recording. In this episode, Alison digs deep to share how the crucible of suffering and loss that she endured with her dad is changing her. So listen closely. Alison has grappled with death and returned, bearing hard-won gifts of clarity and wisdom for all of us. How can her experience with death change how you live? Alison is a creative at heart and a veteran of the hospitality industry who specializes in curated experiences and event design, from one-on-one partnerships to festivals. Her company, Wise Aspirations, creates containers that inspire expression, expansion, collaboration, and healing. As you'll hear, her experience with her dad's death has focused her understanding of her purpose in the world more sharply than ever before. Without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Alison, what led you to jump into the deep end with your dad and stay there until he died? From the very beginning, because you just as easily could have been much less involved and invested and let your mom shoulder most of the burden, for example, but you didn't. You chose a different path. What led you to jump into the deep end and stay there?
From the beginning, it felt like the perfect storm. You know, COVID had just happened. I had lost my job. There was already waves of grief, you know, crashing around the world. And I felt that I had space. And even if I didn't, I always really looked up to my dad and admired him. He was my number one supporter along my journey of creative entrepreneurship and just like full-blown self-expression. I sensed this coming. I really can't explain it. I experienced this immense, deep feeling of grief that was unexplainable, and finally put words to it and saying that, you know, I felt that something was going to happen to my family. And the next day I got the call that my dad was going into emergency brain surgery. And so it was really an answer to the ringing that was already going on, just this validation that my intuition was correct. And I just felt that I couldn't ignore that. I didn't feel anything. I just acted. And for a long time there, it was like, yeah, I'm going to support my dad in his process of death and dying. And I would just say it. like, yeah, I'm doing this. And then I would act on it like, yeah, I'm doing this. This is what I'm doing. And I mustered up a lot of passion around it. I shared it a lot. And
were there ever moments where you wanted to dip out or be like, whoa, I mean, first I wanted to jump in, but this is a big deal. And I'm not sure if I want to keep going in the way that you had been, at least.
There were moments where I did dip out. I needed to. There was the brain surgery, and then there was the receipt of the terminal diagnosis. And I see those as two separate experiences, even though there was a great chance that he wouldn't have made it out of surgery. So in those 10 days that I remember being back east, however long the surgery was and waiting for the call from the surgeon, I had already accepted his death as much as I knew how, because there was no guarantee that he would return. Yeah, and then the diagnosis was its own thing. And I really latched it on to this idea of like, I want to learn my dad's legacy. Like, this is my time to do it. There's no other time than now. And so that was my driver. There was nothing else that mattered other than that.
Tell you what, there's the incomparable power of inevitable mortality to focus our attention, to focus our energy, to focus our priorities. Sounds like it did precisely that for you. The options were few for you and very clear what you were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's only been, 9-10 months since your dad died? Still very fresh. And in a prior conversation, you mentioned how fresh the grief is just on a deeply visceral and emotional level for you, and makes perfect sense. Maybe this question is premature, but I'll throw it out there to see how it lands for you. That would simply be, how has this very deeply personal encounter with mortality changed you? What are you aware of so far?
Well, I feel that I have an acute awareness of this idea that no moment is ever guaranteed. I often think about, the people in my life and how they could die at any given moment. And my own death flashes before my eyes. I don't want to say daily because that I feel could sound obsessive. And though it's a lot, I think about it a lot. And I always had this gust for life. Like, I always had this drive and this passion to deeply connect and deeply live and explore and expand and express. And from my experience with my dad, I now so feel that is even more potent. There's also this new connection to the experience of death and dying, and how I want to utilize my experience and what I went through to serve my community, and through listening, through creating new pathways, and through acting as a spiritual guide, and really taking on that responsibility to clear myself of anything that may be holding me back from being a grounding force in the presence of others. And I have a lot of work to do in that area.
Which area specifically? Being a grounding force?
I feel that there's so much going on in the world that it takes a lot of intentionality to clear what may be in the way. And so I really latch on to, my healing practices and modalities to get me right so that I can hold space for others. And also just this concept of legacy and connection to legacy, of where I come from and who I am, who I actually am. Through this experience, I have an understanding of who I am in a way that I never tapped into before.
Say more about that, because it's not obvious that the experience of walking with your dad through the process of his death to his death would produce that. How do you think that experience has amplified your sense of urgency almost around legacy? And what does legacy mean to you when you say it? A bunch of questions all at once, but go for it.
Yeah, well, I have learned that legacy is a moment-to-moment creation, and the connection to that creation comes from our story, what we've been through and where we come from. And my experience of walking alongside my dad, and I like to say looking death in the face of my hero, what I saw in him was courage and resilience and openness. And he had this passion to serve. And so just observing him in this time of uncertainty and where has lost so much of himself, still shine that through until the very end. He was cracking jokes until he was actively dying, and just brought this lightness into this space that was more than I could do. And that was really inspiring to me.
Just a quick interjection that reminds me when my brother-in-law was dying, and it had become pretty clear that no longer was there a possibility of him making it, and he was declining pretty quickly. We were able to be with my sister and him and their family, and my parents. Ended up being about 10 days, I guess, before he died. And he was in rough shape, a shadow of his former self. And my boys were like 3 and 5 or something like that. And Brian was just so engaged with them and warm with them and playful with them and cracking jokes and catching their eye and making funny faces. And it just struck me so much because he clearly knew that he was on his way out. And he was taking the time to engage with my boys in playful ways that they still remember to this day. And just you describing your dad cracking jokes until the point he was actively dying and wasn't capable of doing that, and that not being something that you were able to do. So it's so interesting what people are able to muster and what they're like in those last moments. It's almost like they embrace their death more fully and more quickly than those around them are sometimes willing and able to do.
Yeah, I remember this moment when he was on hospice, and at this time we were with a music therapist. She guided us through music and would play for him, and I made a request that asked her to play Old Man by Neil Young, and I attempted to sing it to my dad, and I'm sitting on his bedside, and of course I didn't get through 10 seconds of the song before I lost it and just completely broke down crying. And I remember getting to lay my head on his chest and cry, and he was just like rubbing my head, telling me that it's going to be okay, and kissing my forehead like I was a little girl. And just that tender moment was just, I will never forget it. And I guess a testament to my own openness in this. I am really grateful that I allowed myself to feel and experience the emotions I was feeling as he was dying and show them to him.
In other words, you weren't attempting to, quote, stay strong for the one who was dying.
Yeah, there was a point where I set my strength aside, and I held on to the strength through and through, and it was like at the point of no return.
Well, it also depends on how we define strength, because I wouldn't necessarily say emotional stonewalling is strength. I mean, there was a lot of vulnerability that you demonstrated with your dad in that moment, and I call that strength in my book.
Yeah, and I come from a long line of emotional stonewallers. And so
that was sort of new territory for you.
Exactly.
Wow.
Brand new.
New frontiers in your family, even as one of the 2 members of that generation of your family is getting ready to leave. What's more important to you, and what's less important to you now than before?
What's important to me now is to live a life that is centered around my heart. I now make decisions from my heart space, whether they're business decisions, family decisions. Like, I really have this new connection to my heart. And what's important for me is to share my story and to advocate for people who may be experiencing a terminal diagnosis, who may be looking death in the face of their hero, people who don't know that choice is an option in the realm of death and dying. Like, I feel that there can be a way that it's supposed to look, and we've been conditioned to believe that and just go along with that. And especially in a time where you feel shattered and broken, how can you know that you have a choice in the matter? Or, take a pause to really consider what you might want out of this. And I really have a passion for normalizing conversations around death and dying well before it's a crisis, so that we can be just more grounded in our experience and get to experience those deep emotions along the way, because it's so important that we release them along the way. And I feel so blessed that I got to do that with the support of, community and my yoga practice, or like two of those big ones that I will continue to stay connected to. Sobriety is really important to me. Clarity, just living in my truth.
I got a bunch of questions for you that came out of everything you just said here. And before you get too far along, I better ask one of them so I don't lose the thread. You mentioned that it's really important to you, more important than it was before, to live from your heart. And I wonder, how do you know when you're living from your heart? What does it look like to live from your heart? What does it feel like to live from your heart? What are the results of living from your heart versus living from some other source primarily? And I'm personally interested in that one because I realized within myself over the past few years that I feel like there is a pretty distinct head, heart, gut, soul short circuit going on. Like, some people can say where they feel an emotion in their body, and like my coach will ask me that, and I'll be like, I got nothing for you. I mean, I don't feel that anywhere necessarily. And so I'm very curious about like this. What does it mean for you to live from your heart? How do you know when you're doing it? Why is that important?
It's this feeling of not knowing anything, like not knowing what's next. And I experience an openness in my chest center. Physically, I have these serendipitous, yesterday you said something like serendipity is strategic, or this is how I received it. Serendipity is strategic and sent from source is what I am hearing. And I'm speaking my truth by sharing my story, and my passions are fluidly, what I'm passionate about is flowing out of me in every interaction that I have. And it's leading to other connections that are connecting. And yeah, I guess I don't know how to answer that.
Well, I can reflect back to you what I'm hearing and kind of how the words I'm using within myself as I say it. So there's an openness to what may come. There's an element of faith that as you continue to make yourself available in the world and cross paths with people and live honestly, in the sense that you're doing your best at least not to present a version of yourself that isn't really you. I think it's very difficult to know when we're 100% authentically being ourselves, but we're at least making an effort, right? So those are some things I'm hearing, that's some of how you know you're living from your heart, is there's an openness, there's an availability, there's a receptivity, there's a commitment to representing yourself honestly in the world with others.
It's also goes back to that knowing of who I am because of my connection to my legacy. I've done the work to get a sense of where I come from and what I choose to carry forward. And knowing that now, it acts as a guide. And I really do carry that in my heart, and I'm clear on my values, and I attempt to generate experiences that are aligned with my values. And it's like this energetic channel that just opens up, and it's connected to the heart, and that's where I'm living from these days.
Fun fact, I've recently learned, and I don't know if every scientist out there would agree with this, but evidently there's 3 brains. There's the head brain, the heart brain, and the gut brain. In physiologically speaking, biologically speaking, that we have neuronal networks in each of those spaces that operate somewhat independently. A goal can be to align those 3 because they're each serving different purposes. So it's very interesting that you bring up heart, because it's not as if that's just sort of it's not necessarily a fluffy concept. I mean, reliving from your heart can be an actual biological reality too. There's some sort of brain activity going on in our hearts, evidently. It's curious to me that this experience led you in the direction of living from your heart more than from your head, because one could easily imagine a situation where you would go through the traumatic death of your dad. I mean, dying from cancer is a brutal process and traumatic for everyone involved, the things that you see, the things that have to be done. It seems to me you could just as easily have emerged from that with a commitment to never experience that kind of pain again, to make sure everyone around you is always okay, to batten down the hatches, to circle the wagons, and to live in a very closed off and head driven kind of way. How come that didn't happen to you?
Well, I always, or not always, and though I've had this awareness that pain is my ultimate teacher and has been. And I've just learned so much about myself and what I'm capable of through experiencing pain and showing up in the fire.
This wasn't for your first dance with pain.
Mm-mm.
It was just maybe the most significant one to date.
Yes.
So you'd already begun to evolve your relationship to pain and understand that even though it may be unwelcome and unwanted, there's something here to be gained.
Yeah. My dad taught me a lot through supporting his brother with a traumatic brain injury. My Uncle Terry had to relearn how to breathe, eat, write, walk, talk, everything. And we had him shooting pool, shooting bow and arrow, playing golf. There was such pain and grief in that experience of losing my Uncle Terry for who he was and having him be this new person with a severe traumatic brain injury, and just believing that anything is possible and that he's still in there and his legacy is valid. That taught me a lot about what I'm here to do in the world. And when my dad ended up with his glioblastoma diagnosis, and it was very similar to this traumatic brain injury I experienced when I was 13.
So you were 13 when your uncle went through that. So you were at a really formative stage when you experienced the loss of your uncle as he was, and then the recovery of a new version of your uncle. And then fast forward 12, 15 years, and you're not the same situation, but one that is traumatic, and you were in some way equipped. It's so interesting. Our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable, and I think you're beginning to get at that these experiences have given you clues as to your purpose in the world. I don't want to lose the what's less important to you bit, and we'll come right back to that, but how has this experience connected you more clearly, closely, deeply with your purpose in the world?
It's hard to say. What I experienced supporting my dad in his process of dying was something that, I can't put on a resume. Anticipating his needs and seeing him for who he was and really embodying that, and just being an inspirational force in his life and showing him that I was okay, and all of these things that I actively did during that time have shaped me in a way that I haven't really come to articulate yet. another big one was just like breaking stigmas and being with him in public and with his blind man stick and fumbling with his money and just like holding space for him to feel independent and to feel empowered. And I really found great purpose in that. And I feel that there is a great need for that in the world. And I just want to be one of the people that are doing it and that are modeling it and teaching kids and teaching adults and just through simply being who I am as a leader in the world.
It sounds to me like this experience did a couple things, at least. One of them was it revealed in you capacities that perhaps hadn't yet been clear to you, to be able to be that person who was an inspiration to your dad in those moments, to be able to be the person who allowed him independence in publicly awkward situations, to, be the person who was able to maintain composure in the midst of really, really difficult challenges, that you saw more clearly in yourself things that were there that might not otherwise have been discovered without these experiences. And it equipped you with capacities that you didn't have and maybe couldn't have gained in any other way. So it was a discovery and equipping that took place that's helped you get clearer on how you want to be in the world and who you want to be in the world.
Not long prior to this experience, I battled with addiction for 10 years. And, when I presence my sobriety and my clarity, it plays a huge part in all of this. I could have easily numbed the pain that I was experiencing, which is what I knew how to do best. And with this perfect storm of time and space and support systems that came in alignment during this season of my life, I was able to show up fully for it. And I don't take that lightly anymore. I can't.
Wow. Are you familiar with the hero's journey?
Not so much.
I've got a picture up there on the wall. You can look at it when we're done, but it's a way of understanding the pattern that happens in most of the mythologies around the world, ancient and modern. But it's also a way of understanding our own journey in the world. And the hero, you, me, starts off in our status quo normal life. Then there's some adventure that lands on our doorstep, welcome or unwelcome. Then we resist the call to adventure, typically. And then there's some intervention from another person, often if it's of divine origin, but it can be Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, for example, who encourages us to go ahead and respond to the call to adventure. Then you leave the status quo and you drop below this horizon line that separates the known from the unknown, and you drop down into the land of the unknown, and the outcome is completely uncertain. And as you're describing your experience with your dad, it just reminds me of that, how the two of you went on this hero's journey together. And somewhere along that path, your dad took his path out of this life. You've continued in this mortal life as we know it. And you've returned, as everyone who goes on a hero's journey does, with treasure that can only be gained going through all of those ordeals in the underworld of the unknown, slaying the dragons you had to slay, going through the uncertainty. There was no other path to get that gold behind the dragon, so to speak. Much of the gold that it sounds like you've acquired is a deeper awareness of who you are and what's essential for you and what you're made of.
What I have to offer moving forward.
And that's part of that gold we bring back on the hero's journey, is that you're now a new person. You're a fundamentally different person than you were when you started out on this journey with your dad.
Completely transformed.
And you may return to the same geographic place where you lived, but it's different now because you're different now.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm sorry for the way that you had to acquire this treasure. It would have been great to have done it another way. But I'm grateful for you for having this conversation to help us who haven't been to that frontier yet. We all will at some point, but many of us listening haven't been to that frontier in the way that you have, traveled through that land of the unknown, and you've been kind to share. We're not done yet, but I just want to acknowledge you've been kind to share with us your initial understanding of the treasures that you brought back and what you're planning to do with it. And this conversation today is one of those things you're going to do with it. Like, you're going to tell your story and keep making sense of it for yourself and helping others make sense of it for them and what it means to them. I want to get back real quickly before we lose it to what's less important to you now than before. That's a bit of treasure you could offer us, because what you say, I will take very seriously and put into practice in my life.
Being on stage is a big one.
That's less important.
Mm-hmm. Coming from the world of hospitality, I feel that I spent a lot of time on stage in a light that wasn't true to me. And the hustling to work, hustling to build my ego, hustling to have something to say that I'm up to, new. That's out the window. The ego is a huge one. Something that will always be present.
What do you mean when you say that? Ego can be used in a lot of different ways. What do you mean?
It's a masked version of who I am. The strong individual that has it all together and looks successful. It's different now. Success, to me, moving forward, looks like being of service, serving through my experience, transmuting like my wisdom, sharing what I know, sharing what I have. Yeah, and in that, I'm letting go of all the bullshit, all the stories that aren't my truth, the stories that I replay in my head about how people feel about me, or the stories of how I'm the black sheep, the stories that I'm not loved, these stories that I've told myself that have caused me a lot of harm. I'm letting go of those.
How? I mean, how is this experience providing that kind of escape velocity? Like for a rocket to get out of gravity's grasp, it's got to achieve escape velocity. How are you achieving escape velocity with these stories through this experience in ways that eluded you before?
Forgiveness and acceptance are two great tools that I use. Honestly, I don't know how to use them. I'm just trying to let go of the stories.
Is some of it because it's simply not a good use of time in light of mortality, in light of how important other things are? And so it's almost just like saying, I'm done with that. I'm just done. Is it like that? Is it almost that simple?
Correct. Yeah. I acknowledge that there is this dense, dark force that is just swirling around all the time. And it has this density and this strong magnetic pull. And naturally, I feel that I've been conditioned to, or I just naturally go there. I choose to rebel against that and be a lighthouse. The way I'm seeing to do that is to simply lean into acceptance and unconditional love and kindness.
To all of us listening, everything you're saying just reminds me once again of how unmatched mortality is in its power to liberate us. Because your desperately difficult encounter with your dad's mortality was the crucible out of which these new forms of freedom in your life were created. And none of us wants that. You didn't want that, but that has been the product. So how can we, listening, invite mortality, the mortality mindset, into our lives more regularly and allow it to set us free? Because it clarifies for us, unlike anything I've ever encountered, what's important and what's not. It's giving you the ability, newfound capacity, to let go of old stories that haunted you for years and probably, were complicit in the addictive cycles you experienced and all those things. You tried a lot of things before, and none of them have had quite the liberating power of this encounter with mortality. And so this is no joke. We think that if we encounter mortality or consider mortality, then in some way it'll do us harm, and it's quite the opposite. It sets us free. Your story is certainly an example of that. Mine is too, many others. What do you hope that we all take away from your story? If you could bottle it and give it to us and we would ingest it precisely as you formulated it.
Choose to face the fire when it's in front of you, especially if you're looking to leave a legacy of love. Don't turn your head away from the truth. Show up for it. Get curious about it. Do a dance with it. And in this context, truth being mortality, don't run away from it. Face it. It's inevitable for each and every one of us, and no moment is guaranteed. And so how can we get more connected to our truth and who we are and what we want in the world and how we're here to serve? I once heard that, service is the ultimate bliss, or at least that's what I see it as. My biggest goal is to experience bliss, and how I see to do that is through service. And the best way I see to serve is through my life experiences. And you can't gain life experiences if you're not facing life head on as it is.
And so many of us in big and little ways are taking great pains to avoid life as it is. Whether it's distracting ourselves with all kinds of menial tasks, or burying ourselves in substances, or burying ourselves in trying to make sure our kids' lives are perfect. I mean, so many of us are distracting ourselves from life as it is, and the very difficult realities that brings along with it. And again, I think you and I both want to say to all of our listeners, embrace life as it is, and that includes embracing mortality. And one of my hopes that I've just gotten a little bit clear on as we've been talking is that I'd love when I die, as long as it's not sudden and unexpected and I don't have the chance to say this, but when it shows up, to be like, I've been expecting you. In fact, I've been preparing for you, and I'm ready, because I've been sort of allowing myself to die along the way, not in a macabre sense, but like I was fully living, but that was in preparation for my inevitable death. And wouldn't that be a cool thing to be able to say, rather than for it to be regret-filled and it's too little too late, and relationships aren't mended, and dreams are unfulfilled, and my service in the world is incomplete, and I realized that I was a coward rather than courageous, and sounds awful.
Yeah, and I see possibility in connecting to legacy and living from the story where you come from and what you're here to create. Like, get clear. What is it? It's unique to each and every individual. And that thing that you sense is yours to create is absolutely 100% yours to create. And there is an abundance of space for that thing and resources and support for that thing. And it's your responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I was hoping you were going to say a word like that. I was waiting for that.
Yeah, it is my responsibility to step into creation in any given moment moving forward.
And anyone who's listening who's like, well, I have no idea what my purpose is, or I'm not even clear what my story is, I want to encourage you that your purpose in the world isn't necessarily out there for you to go discover. Your purpose is right with you. It is in your story. So get to know your story better, and you'll begin to find unmistakable clues about what you were made to do and the life you were made to live, as Alison is, and as I am as well. How can our listeners connect with you?
Well, you can Google me. Wise Aspirations is my Instagram handle. You can also Google Wise Aspirations Event Design. I have a link tree on my Instagram account where I will post helpful links or resources as I am turning a new leaf in my season with grief and getting back to a season of creation. And I intend to continue to write my story and share my story on my social media platform. Reading what I've written is a great way to get connected to me. And I'm just like always open to receiving any sort of reaching out that comes my way.
Thanks so much for being with us today and for sharing your story. It's still very fresh. And so I don't know what it feels like to share your story when it's this fresh, but thank you for the courage and the vulnerability to do so. It's very valuable to us who haven't had that experience, but who can be transformed by it nonetheless. So thank you for being willing to put your experience to work for us. And to all of you listening out there, remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it. What stuck with you from Alison's story? Pause for a few moments. Allow your mind to quiet down and your heart to bring to the surface the one or two things from this conversation that are especially for you. As Alison exhorted us, don't turn your head away from the truth. Whatever your heart whispers to you in response to this episode, even if it's unpleasant or unwelcome, don't turn away from it. Instead, summon the courage to acknowledge it. Then, write it down so it becomes just a bit more real. Do that right now. Now, what's one thing, no matter how small, that you are willing and able to do to put one of your insights into action? Insight plus action equals transformation. By when will you do it? Let Alison's story change yours. Let the mortality mindset change you before a crisis of your own makes it too late. In the Graveyard Group, swap out willpower for we power with the weekly support of your very own confidential board of advisors. Harness the power of the mortality mindset to break free from the status quo, become the person you are made to be, and live the life you are made to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. New groups for men and women are forming now. Visit andrewpettycoach.com to schedule a free 1-hour coaching session with me. Find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@andrewpettycoach.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.